everyone, and welcome to my next video tutorial, which is the second video in my series for the Patreon paint along. So in this video I'm going to be doing some dark skin on this guy here. If you haven't watched the first video, I'd highly recommend watching that. That's the one for the light skin tones, because through this video the approach that I'm going to be taking with this dark skin tone is very similar to the light skin tone in terms of the layering techniques and highlighting and recess shading and stuff like that. So I don't really want to explain all of that again in this video. I want to keep this one a bit shorter, so I would highly recommend you go back and watch that one if you want to get a bit more of an explanation of what I'm doing. So we're going to go ahead and start painting this guy. So for the base coat, I'm working with a 1 to 2 parts of Night, Questor and Rhinox hide. Just like the previous video, I'm using quite a large brush for this, just to get good coverage. And once again, I'm not worrying too much about being too neat with this. If I get a bit of overbrushing onto the surrounding parts, it's easily fixed later. Alright, so there we go. After applying 2 coats, we've got a nice, clean, smooth base coat to work off. So the next step is to start applying some recess shading. So for that I'm going for an equal parts mix of Rhinox hide and Abaddon black. I've also switched to a finer brush because what I'm doing, as per the previous video, is just starting to line in some of the recesses, getting a bit more definition in the muscles. Under these deep recesses here. And those kinds of areas. Creating our darkest shadow point. The base coat itself is on the darker scale of the mid-tone. It's kind of going to form one of the darker kind of areas of the skin, because we're going to be doing a lot of highlighting on top. So you see I defined the fingers by lining in between each finger. Following the creases of those muscles. One of the areas that I want to work that into is the eye sockets as well. And making sure I separate that hairline from the skin there. I've darkened enough under here so that later on the jaw will start to stand out more, as I kind of explained in the first video. Alright, well, there we go. So quite a quick step. It can be a little bit tedious getting around getting all those recesses, but it definitely makes a difference in helping to define things a bit better. Alright, so next we're going to start moving on to some highlighting with the first highlight layer. Okay, so for the first highlight layer, what I'm working with is an equal parts mix of Night Questor and Rhinox Hide. And so, as per the previous video, what I've done with that layer, with this mix, is thinned it down quite a bit so that I get quite translucent layers, and I can start to build up in thin layers and manipulating where the paint goes in a sort of a glazing style. If you want a better explanation of that, you'd have to check out the first video. Basically, I'm pushing the paint towards where I want it to settle the most, and I will later on layer that up, because as these thin layers get layered up, they become more concentrated, and you can play around with, building up layers to highlight the areas that you want to highlight. It's quite a quick way to get a nice transition between each highlight layer. Okay, so it's quite a subtle highlight, but now what we can do is, as I mentioned, I can start layering that up. So I can start doing another layer of that same mix. And as I mentioned, because it does have that slight translucency, as I build this on top, the second layer is going to make those areas look more pronounced. It might be subtle again, but that's why we're going to move on to doing some more layers of highlighting after this. So basically what I'm trying to do is, in some areas I'm just kind of completely going over what I've already done in terms of the previous layer. I'm completely building on top of that to sharpen it, to strengthen it. In some areas I can kind of hold back a bit and let some of the previous layer show through so that I'm getting that gradient happening. It's working quite quickly with this. Alright, so the next highlight layer is getting a bit more Night Questor into the mix. So what I'm working with is 3 parts Night Questor to 1 part Rhinox Hide. And again, thin down to the same consistency as before. And what I'm doing now is a very similar approach to the previous step. But the areas that I'm covering are a much smaller area. And that way I start getting a bit of a transition happening between the layers. Alright, that is pretty much it for that layer. And so again, as per the previous one, if you wanted to, you could go over and start to enhance some of those areas just by applying another layer. I really like to try to define the knuckles on the hands. It just really helps make the hands look a bit more, you know, the shape that they're supposed to be. Alright, so that's it for that layer, and I'm going to start moving on to the next highlight layer now. Alright, so now basically we're going to move into some stages that are really just start sharpening everything up. And so what we want to work with now is Night Questor. The consistency is a lot thicker than what we've been working with, because what I'm doing now is I'm going to start applying some basically like sharp edge highlights just to start to get a lot more definition happening. Let's start defining these muscles a lot more. Basically, I'm applying it to tops of muscles. I mentioned that it's good to get some nice highlights happening on the knuckles to really define those. The face is an area that will definitely get some attention with this. Getting some subtle highlights in there. Alright, and then the last highlight is just to apply some really sharp, fine spot highlights, and that's with a 1-to-1 mix of Night Questor and Ungor Flesh. So it's gone quite light, and what this will do is help to really define some of the details that we want to stand out. I'm thinking about the face, because the face will be the focal point of the model, or one of the focal points of the model. So getting those sharp highlights in on the temple there, around the cheeks and things. Again, the knuckles. Getting a lot of definition in those. And then the very tops. Some of the muscles. I'll just be catching some of that strong light. Alright, there we are. So, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out, and I'm going to leave it at that. So, the only other thing that I've done is the eyes. As you can see, you can't see the other one too well, but that one there, I painted that in the same way that I painted the eyes in the first video, with the light skin tones, using Flayed One Flesh for the whites of the eye. But I did use Abaddon Black for the recesses to help define the eye socket a bit more, but also for the iris itself I used Abaddon Black as well, just to help it stand out a bit more. So yeah, that's where I'm leaving that video, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that it's helpful, and stay tuned for more videos for the paint along. Thank you so much for your continued support. Thanks.